The Blue Ridge Mountains rose like silent sentinels, their jagged peaks shrouded in mist, a place where the wind whispered secrets through the pines and the streams sang songs older than any living man. In the shadows of these mountains, a boy was born into a life that would demand both his body and spirit in equal measure. He came into the world under the weight of chains, though they were invisible at birth, for his fate had already been claimed by the cruel laws of the land. His parents, like all others on the plantation, tucked into the lower slopes of the mountains, were enslaved, their lives dictated by a master who believed that dominion was both his right and his necessity. From the earliest days, the boy learned to read the world with caution, to recognize the subtle shifts in the air that hinted at danger, and to find moments of solace in places where the eyes of overseers could not reach. The mornings were bitter, filled with labor that seemed endless and purposefully exhausting. The boy would rise before the sun had fully crested the horizon, his small hands already raw from chores meant for men twice his age. He would follow the older slaves through the misty fields and the dense underbrush, carrying bundles, gathering firewood, and tending to livestock. Each step left an imprint in the soft soil, a mark of survival that went unnoticed by the masters, but was etched into the boy's consciousness. He learned to work with speed, to anticipate the whims of those in power, and to move with a quiet efficiency that allowed him to complete his tasks while remaining just under the threshold of attention. Every day was a lesson in invisibility, a training in the art of appearing submissive while nurturing a mind that was already restless with questions of freedom, justice, and escape. In the evenings, when the sun dipped behind the mountains and painted the world in hues of crimson and gold, the boy would find small reprieves. He would slip away from the gaze of overseers, sometimes with a sibling or a friend, and wander the forest paths. There, the air smelled of damp earth and pine resin, and the silence was profound, broken only by the rustling of leaves or the distant call of a hawk. In these moments, he observed everything, the way the deer moved with cautious grace, the patterns of birds as they built nests, the behavior of the streams as they twisted and turned through rocks and roots. Nature, in its indifference, became his tutor. He learned patience from the streams, cunning from the foxes, and resilience from the ancient trees that clung stubbornly to cliffs and slopes despite the harsh winters. The mountains themselves seemed to whisper that survival required not brute strength alone, but knowledge, observation, and the ability to move unseen when necessary. His home was a crude cabin on the edge of the plantation, little more than a shelter of rough-hewn logs with a roof patched in places with bark and mud. The interior was dim and crowded, with the smell of smoke and the faint, lingering scent of the previous day's cooking. The cabin held his family, and though it offered little in comfort, it provided a space where they could share stories, pass knowledge, and nurture a quiet defiance. His parents, despite the exhaustion etched into their faces, tried to instill in him a sense of worth and a spark of hope. They whispered tales of ancestors who had once lived free, of distant lands beyond the mountains where the world was not dictated by chains, and of the subtle victories that came from patience, observation, and cunning. These stories, passed down in hushed tones at night, became the boy's first lessons in the idea that one could survive mentally even when the body was bound. School was a foreign concept here. The boy learned not from books but from the world around him. He learned the hidden paths through the forest that led to water and food. He learned to identify plants that could heal minor wounds or soothe a fever, and he memorized the patterns of seasons, the timing of rains, and the behavior of animals, each detail a thread in the web of knowledge that might one day keep him alive or even offer an opportunity for freedom. Observation became second nature. He watched the masters and overseers, noting the rhythms of their days, the weak points in their routines, the small lapses in attention that could be exploited. Every glance, every command, every punishment was recorded in his mind, not as mere cruelty, but as a map of power that, if understood, could one day be turned against those who wielded it. Yet life in the mountains was not only a lesson in survival, it was a crucible of pain and loss. He witnessed the harsh punishments inflicted on those who stepped out of line, men and women beaten until their bodies were raw, chained, and left for hours to serve as warnings to others. The cries of the punished haunted the boy, embedding themselves deep within his consciousness. The sight of families torn apart, of parents sold to distant plantations, of children separated from their siblings, instilled a cold understanding of the stakes. The mountains offered beauty, yes, but they also framed every cruelty in sharp relief, reminding him constantly that life under slavery was precarious and fragile. Despite the brutality, there were small joys, fleeting yet powerful. A berry hidden and eaten in secret, a fish caught in the stream with careful patience, the warmth of a shared laugh with a friend during a brief respite. These moments became treasures. They were not escapes from reality, but affirmations that life still pulsed within them, that the human spirit could endure, adapt, and even find joy amidst oppression. The boy learned to cherish these moments, to use them as fuel for endurance, and to remember that even the smallest victories mattered. As he grew, so did his understanding of the landscape around him. He learned that every tree could hide a path, every rock could conceal a trap, every hollow could serve as shelter. He began to think strategically, imagining scenarios where knowledge of the terrain could be leveraged for survival or escape. He studied the movements of the master's patrols, the ways the overseers communicated, and the vulnerabilities in the plantation's layout. His mind, sharpened by necessity, began to see patterns where others saw only chaos. This growing awareness was coupled with a deepening sense of injustice, a quiet anger that simmered beneath the surface, controlled but never extinguished. The boy also began to understand the power of patience. He observed that hasty actions could lead to disaster, that subtlety and timing often yielded more success than brute force. He learned to wait for opportunities, to let anger and fear simmer into a calm, deliberate resolve. These lessons were reinforced through daily experiences, from avoiding suspicion during chores to navigating encounters with aggressive animals or unpredictable weather. Every challenge was a lesson in adaptation, a preparation for something larger, though the boy could not yet fully articulate what that might be. By the time he reached adolescence, the boy was no longer merely surviving. He was learning to think beyond survival. He envisioned the mountains as both sanctuary and weapon, the cabin as both home and potential stronghold, the experiences of his early life, the harshness of labor, the cruelty of the overseers, and the quiet teachings of the forest had forged a mind that was patient, observant, and cunning. He had learned that freedom was not a given, that power could be subtle, and that the most important battles were often won not with force, but with intelligence, knowledge, and timing. Even in the darkest moments, he clung to hope. He understood that the chains that bound him were physical, but they did not yet touch the essence of his mind. As he moved through the forests, tending to chores or exploring the hidden paths, he began to imagine a life beyond the plantation, a life where he could command his destiny rather than being at the mercy of others. The mountains, with their untamed beauty and hidden dangers, had become both his classroom and his ally, shaping him into someone who could endure, strategize, and one day, perhaps, reclaim the power that had been stolen from him at birth. The boy's life in the shadows of the Blue Ridge was harsh and often cruel, but it was also formative. Every sunrise brought new lessons. Every laborious day honed his body and mind, and every evening in the quiet of the forest offered reflection and insight. In this crucible of oppression and natural splendor, he began to grow not only as a survivor, but as a thinker, a planner, and ultimately someone capable of transforming the very environment that constrained him into a foundation for his eventual defiance. The mountains, once a backdrop to suffering, were slowly becoming the stage upon which his destiny would be enacted. And within the boy, a spark of resolve burned steadily, ready to ignite when the time was right. The first time the boy truly felt the stirrings of defiance, it was a quiet, simmering moment that began to etch itself into the deepest part of his mind. He had grown accustomed to the daily grind of labor, the whip cracking, the overseer's shouted commands, the relentless pressure of life under chains. Yet that day in the Blue Ridge, something changed. It was a morning like any other. The fog rolling low across the foothills, dew clinging to leaves, and the world awakening slowly under a pale winter sun, he had been tasked with hauling firewood from the far side of the mountain, a treacherous path littered with jagged rocks and hidden roots, when he witnessed a cruelty so deliberate, so malicious, that it left a mark not just on his mind, but on the core of his being. An older slave, a man who had been both mentor and protector to him, had stumbled on the icy path, the weight of the wood he carried nearly toppling him. The overseer, a gaunt man with a face like carved stone, saw this faltering not as an accident, but as an opportunity to assert dominance. With a cruel smile, he drew the whip and struck the man repeatedly, each lash a physical punctuation to a lesson in obedience and fear. The boy watched, frozen at first, the sound of the whip slicing through the cold morning air echoing off the mountains. The older man's cries were a mixture of pain and defiance, a sound that seared itself into the boy's memory. And in that moment, the boy felt something awaken, an understanding that submission was not his only choice, that endurance was not enough, and that intelligence, cunning, and patience could serve as tools to turn the world on its head. From that day forward, the boy's observations took on a new intensity. He no longer merely noticed the paths, the hidden nooks of the forest, and the behavior of animals. He studied people with the same careful attention. He watched the overseer's rhythms, the guards' predictable patterns, the moments when the masters were distracted by their own indulgences or pride. Every detail became a thread in a tapestry. Why? That he slowly wove a map of weaknesses and vulnerabilities. He began to catalog the tools left unattended, the gates left loosely latched, the quiet corners where one could hide or eavesdrop. His mind, sharpened by years of survival, now had purpose, directed by a singular focus, understanding the mechanisms of oppression in order to exploit them. Patience became his most powerful weapon. He learned that raw anger, while intense and consuming, could be dangerous if unleashed prematurely. He saw the consequences of impulsive acts in those who had tried to resist and failed, their punishment serving as warnings to others. Instead, he cultivated a slow-burning resolve, imagining scenarios, rehearsing actions in his mind, and testing outcomes without ever revealing his intentions. At night, when the cabin was quiet and the others slept, he would lie awake, plotting silently, tracing the routes through the forest, imagining how he might slip past the eyes of the overseers, or how he could use the land itself as an ally. Every stone, every tree, every stream became a part of his strategy, a component of a plan that existed at first only in thought, but would one day take tangible form. His defiance was not loud, it was quiet, almost imperceptible. He began small, testing boundaries with calculated risks. A tool misplaced here, a minor act of sabotage there, a secret gathering of provisions, all done with the care of someone learning the mechanics of rebellion. Each small success was a confirmation of his growing capabilities, a subtle taste of control in a life otherwise dominated by the whims of others. He realized that courage alone was not enough. Intelligence, timing, and discretion were paramount. Even a single misstep could result in death, yet he understood that without action the chains would never loosen. During this period, he also became acutely aware of hue, man's psychology, both in the oppressors and among the enslaved. He saw fear and pride as two sides of the same coin in those who ruled, and he learned to manipulate small perceptions without exposing himself. A glance, a well-timed act of obedience, a carefully concealed defiance, all were part of a growing repertoire of subtle manipulations. Among his fellow slaves, he began to sense whom he could trust, who was capable of silence, and who might falter under pressure. These judgments were never easy, and the boy learned that betrayal could be sudden and devastating, yet they were essential skills in a world where trust was rare and vigilance constant. The forest itself became both mentor and ally in these days of quiet planning. He explored more daring paths, discovering hidden grottos and rock formations that could provide cover or vantage points. He noted the timing of animal movements, the places where predators and prey crossed paths, and even the influence of the weather on visibility and terrain. These lessons in observation extended beyond survival into strategy. He realized that knowledge of the environment could offset physical disadvantage, and that he could turn the very landscape of the Blue Ridge Mountains into a weapon if only he exercised patience and cunning. There was also a personal reckoning. The boy began to understand that vengeance, though tempting, needed careful calibration. Hatred could be blinding, and the desire for immediate retribution could undermine the long-term goal of freedom and survival. He struggled with the moral dimensions of his emerging defiance, how to balance justice with pragmatism, how to strike without becoming consumed by anger. Each night he wrestled with these questions quietly, refining not only his strategies, but also his inner discipline. He understood that the path he envisioned required more than brute force. It required intellect, foresight, and a capacity for restraint that few around him had mastered. This period also marked the beginning of his understanding of fortification. He would experiment with small structures, creating hidden compartments in the forest where he could store food, tools, or weapons without discovery. He tested the strength of branches and rocks, imagining how they could be used to block or slow pursuers. He paid attention to natural choke points, slopes, and ledges that could give him the advantage in a confrontation. The boy's shack, though humble, began to exist in his mind as more than a home. It became a potential fortress, a place where knowledge, preparation, and patience could converge to create something powerful from the most modest resources. Socially, he remained outwardly compliant. To the overseers and masters, he was still the obedient, unassuming boy who toiled without complaint. But inside, a plan was taking shape, invisible to anyone who might otherwise have crushed it before it could mature. He learned to hide his thoughts, to mask emotions, and to convey obedience while silently cataloging vulnerabilities and opportunities. This dual existence, obedience in public, defiance in mind, was exhausting but essential. It honed his discipline and prepared him for a life in which secrecy and observation would be as vital as courage or physical strength. Over time, his observations grew more sophisticated. He began to notice patterns in punishment, routines of work and rest, and moments when attention waned among those in power. He realized that humans, like nature, were predictable when studied carefully, and that predictability could be leveraged. He also noted the strengths and weaknesses of his fellow slaves, imagining alliances, contingencies, and diversions that could aid him when the time came. He became a student of human behavior, learning that subtle manipulation, psychological insight, and careful timing could sometimes achieve more than direct confrontation ever could. By the end of this period, the boy had transformed internally. He was no longer merely a survivor, he was a strategist, a thinker, and a silent resistor. The spark of defiance had grown into a steady flame, fueled by observation, intelligence, and a careful understanding of both human and natural systems. He realized that revenge was not an impulsive act, but a carefully orchestrated endeavor, one that required patience, foresight, and meticulous planning. Each day, each observation, each minor act of calculated defiance brought him closer to the vision that had begun as a flicker of anger on that cold morning, watching the older slaves suffer. He also understood the stakes. Discovery could mean death, and yet the cost of inaction, of allowing cruelty to go unchallenged, was a slow, soul-crushing surrender. With this awareness, he honed his mind into a precise instrument, capable of seeing opportunities where others saw only obstacles, of remaining patient where others might have acted rashly, and of using every element of his environment, human, animal, and landscape alike, as part of a broader strategy. He became a silent observer, a hidden force accumulating knowledge, strength, and courage, preparing for the moment when the mountains themselves would bear witness to his transformation from a boy in chains to a man capable of turning his shack and his surroundings into a fortress of revenge. Even in the quietest moments when the wind rattled through the trees and the snow or rain muffled the sounds of the plantation, he felt the growing pulse of purpose. He understood that defiance was not merely an action, but a state of mind, a commitment to seeing beyond immediate suffering toward a future in which power could be reclaimed, however carefully. The forest whispered lessons in patience. The mountains offered strategy in their contours, and the suffering around him provided the moral compass that guided his growing plans. He would wait, he would observe, he would prepare, and one day, when all pieces were in place, the boy who had once bent under the weight of chains would rise, not recklessly, but with precision, intelligence, and the patient fury of a man who had known injustice too deeply to ignore it. In those years, defiance became his companion, invisible but constant, guiding every choice and sharpening every instinct. It was no longer a fleeting spark born of anger. It was a quiet, persistent flame, a steady light in a dark world, and the foundation upon which every act of courage, every measure of cunning, and every eventual strike of revenge would be built. The shack had once been a modest structure, little more than 4 rough-hewn walls and a roof patched with bark and mud, but in the mind of the boy, it was beginning to take on a new significance. Every plank, every stone, every nook of the surrounding forest became a part of a vision, a plan that he nurtured quietly over months and years. He had grown from a boy into a young man, his body hardened by labor, and his mind sharpened by observation and strategy. He no longer saw the shack as mere shelter. It was the heart of a fortress, a place where knowledge, cunning, and patience would converge to create something far stronger than its humble appearance suggested. The transformation would not be sudden, for he knew that haste was dangerous. Each step had to be deliberate, invisible to the eyes of overseers, masters, and curious neighbors, who would see only the ordinary labor of a compliant slave. He began with the walls. The logs, rough and uneven, were reinforced with additional layers scavenged from the surrounding forest. Easily fitted to reduce gaps and eliminate weak points. In places where the wood could not provide sufficient strength, he inserted stones, wedging them tightly so that they would hold under pressure. He experimented with angles, testing the resilience of each corner, learning which configurations could withstand weight or force, and which could be exploited to create a trap if needed. Every improvement was made in secret, under the cover of darkness or during times when the overseers were distracted, giving the shack an aura of ordinary simplicity to the casual observer, while concealing a web of hidden strength within. The floor, once bare and uneven, became more than a surface to walk upon. He dug shallow trenches along the perimeter, hidden beneath planks and covered with dirt, creating channels that could trap intruders or slow their movement. The floors were reinforced with stones and thick branches, carefully selected for both strength and concealment. In the corners, he constructed small pits disguised under mats of leaves or straw, where sharp stakes could be hidden to surprise anyone foolish enough to stumble inside. Each modification required patience, precision, and a careful understanding of how human attention could be deceived, and he spent countless hours testing each innovation, learning from small mistakes and adjusting his methods accordingly. He turned his attention to the roof, which he understood as both a defensive barrier and a potential trap. The structure was strengthened with layers of bark and timber, but he also experimented with removable panels and hidden openings, allowing him to observe the surroundings without revealing his presence. From these vantage points, he could see approaching visitors or patrols, gaining crucial seconds to prepare a retreat. The roof, like every other element of the shack, was designed to serve multiple PU, or POs, shelter, observation post, and part of a system of defenses that would make any assault against him costly and dangerous. Entrances and exits received particular attention. The door, simple in appearance, was reinforced with hidden braces and locks that could be manipulated from the inside. He created multiple secret exits, carefully camouflaged within the walls or under brush, allowing him to vanish into the forest at a moment's notice. Each passage required meticulous planning, for discovery could mean death, yet the young man understood that freedom often relied on escape routes, on the ability to vanish and reappear when least expected. He mapped these paths in his mind, memorizing the twists, turns, and landmarks so that even in darkness or adverse weather, he could navigate with certainty. But the fortress was not merely physical, it was also a psychological structure designed to instill fear and uncertainty in those who might attempt intrusion. He constructed traps along the approach to the shack, snares hidden beneath leaves, pits covered with branches, and tripwires that, when triggered, would create noise to alert him or startle intruders. Each trap was carefully positioned to exploit predictable patterns of human behavior, taking advantage of curiosity, overconfidence, and ignorance. The young man observed his overseers and neighbors constantly, refining his designs based on their reactions, ensuring that each defensive measure was effective without ever drawing attention to the fortress he was building in secret. Within the shack, he created compartments and hidden spaces for storage. Food, tools, and weapons, carefully scavenged over time, were concealed behind false walls, under floorboards, and inside hollow logs. He understood the importance of sustainability. A fortress was only as strong as its ability to withstand prolonged scrutiny and potential siege. He stockpiled supplies, often at great personal risk, taking only what could be hidden easily and replenishing stock slowly over months of careful observation and stealth. These preparations were not just practical, they were a demonstration of his growing understanding of logistics, strategy, and the importance of foresight in the pursuit of survival and eventual revenge. The surrounding environment became an extension of his fortress. Trees were chosen and pruned to conceal entrances. Rocks were positioned to serve as natural barricades, and undergrowth was manipulated to create channels that could guide or confuse intruders. He studied the movement of animals and the flow of water to anticipate the best ways to move undetected. Even seasonal changes were accounted for. He noted where snow might reveal tracks, where spring rains might soften the ground, and where autumn leaves could mask footsteps. Every aspect of the natural landscape was incorporated into his defenses, making the shack a fortress not only of wood and stone, but of knowledge and environmental mastery. The young man also experimented with signaling systems. Simple but effective methods of alerting himself to approaching danger were implemented. A carefully arranged set of stones that would shift under weight, a hidden bell-like device rigged with string and a stone, and even reflective surfaces that could catch sunlight to send signals across the slopes. These innovations allowed him to maintain situational awareness, to anticipate threats before they became imminent, and to respond with precision. Each system required careful testing and refinement, and mistakes were costly lessons, but over time, they became integrated into a cohesive defensive network. Social interactions were carefully managed. He remained outwardly compliant, even more so than before, masking the true extent of his plans and the intelligence behind his actions. No outsider suspected that beneath the humble appearance of the shack lay a web of ingenuity designed to thwart any who would threaten him. He communicated rarely, and when he did, it was with utmost caution, often using coded language, subtle gestures, or indirect references to convey instructions or warnings to trusted allies. This network of silent communication added another layer to the fortress, extending its reach beyond the physical walls and into the realm of strategy and coordination. Time, patience, and repeated refinement were essential. Each day, he would revisit parts of the shack, test traps, strengthen walls, adjust passages, and stockpile resources. Every modification was recorded in memory, every flaw cataloged and corrected. The fortress grew organically, evolving from a simple shelter into a complex structure that combined elements of defense, concealment, and psychological warfare. It became not only a place of safety, but a statement of intent, a tangible expression of his growing power, intelligence, and refusal to be subjugated. By the time the fortress was fully realized, the young man had transformed in parallel with his creation. His body was hardened from years of labor and survival, and his mind was sharp, disciplined, and strategic. The shack, once humble and vulnerable, now symbolized both his ingenuity and his determination. The lines between home, refuge, and weapon blurred, creating a space that was simultaneously protective and offensive, ordinary in appearance yet extraordinary in function. It was a place from which he could observe, plan, and strike, a center of operations for the defiance that had begun as a quiet spark months or years earlier. Every night, as he lay within the walls he had built, he felt a sense of power that was both intoxicating and terrifying. The shack was more than wood and stone. It was a manifestation of his patience, intelligence, and cunning. It represented his ability to turn vulnerability into strength, invisibility into observation, and oppression into a platform for eventual revenge. It was a fortress built not by armies or wealth, but by careful calculation, courage, and a refusal to accept the constraints imposed upon him by others. And yet he understood that the fortress was only the beginning. While the walls, traps, and secret passages provided security, the real power lay in the combination of preparation and action. He would need patience to wait for the right moment, cunning to exploit weaknesses, and timing to strike with precision. Each element of the fortress was designed to buy him that opportunity, to give him space to transform anger and planning into tangible outcomes. It was both a physical and psychological preparation, an education in strategy, endurance, and the art of war waged from the shadows. The fortress became a symbol in his mind, a center around which all his thoughts, fears, hopes, and plans revolved. It was not merely a structure, but a promise to himself, to those who had suffered with him, and to the oppressors, who would one day face the consequences of their cruelty. Each board placed, each stone wedged, each trap hidden was a step toward reclaiming agency in a world that had denied him freedom. The shack, humble in appearance, was now a bastion of resilience, foresight, and silent power. And the young man within it was no longer merely a survivor. He was a strategist, a protector of his own destiny, and a force quietly preparing for a reckoning that would one day shake the slopes of the Blue Ridge Mountains. The first strike did not announce itself with thunder or fire. It came quietly, almost imperceptibly, a subtle disruption in the rhythm of oppression that had held the Blue Ridge plantation in its iron grip for decades. The young man had spent years observing, preparing, and fortifying his shack into a fortress, but the time had finally come to test the power he had cultivated in patience, cunning, and knowledge of the land. He knew that a reckless act could spell disaster. Yet he also understood that subtlety, timing, and precision were essential if his vengeance was to succeed. The first act was calculated to leave its mark psychologically as much as physically, to create fear and uncertainty among those who had ruled over him and his kin with cruelty and indifference. He waited until the early hours of a fog-laden morning, when the overseers were drowsy, distracted, and convinced of their unquestioned authority. The fog rolled across the slopes like a living shroud, muffling sound and concealing motion. From the concealment of his shack and the surrounding trees, he observed the plantation paths, noting the patrol's predictable routines. He had discovered a weak point where a supply wagon passed a narrow trail lined with boulders and undergrowth, a spot where movement could be disrupted with minimal risk of detection. For weeks he had prepared, setting traps and small obstacles, arranging stones and hidden snares that would surprise and delay anyone attempting to traverse the route. Each element of this first strike had been tested repeatedly, ensuring that it would work precisely as intended without revealing his location. When the moment arrived, he moved with the precision of a predator. One by one, he triggered the hidden mechanisms. Stones shifted to block the wheels of the wagon, ropes hidden under leaves caught and toppled tools, and small tripwires created a cascade of clattering noise that startled the drivers. The chaos was enough to halt progress, sow confusion, and inflict a momentary fear that lingered far longer than the physical inconvenience. From his concealed vantage point, he observed the overseers' frustration mounting, their faces contorted in anger and disbelief. He remained unseen, silent, his pulse steady, taking careful note of every reaction. This initial act of disruption was small but significant, a demonstration that he was no longer powerless, and that the forest, the terrain, and his ingenuity could be weaponized against those who had ruled with arrogance and cruelty. The success of this first strike emboldened him. He realized that fear could be more potent than force, that psychological impact could ripple through the plantation faster than the movement of any single person. He began to plan subsequent actions with increasing sophistication. He would sabotage tools, misplace supplies, and create disturbances that seemed random to the casual observer but were meticulously orchestrated to cause maximum disruption. Each act was designed to instill doubt and paranoia among the overseers, making them question their authority, their safety, and even the competence of their own men. The young man had become not merely a threat, but a shadow of unpredictability, a force operating beyond the comprehension of those who believed themselves in control. Yet he did not act blindly. Every step was measured against risk. He knew that discovery could mean death, yet the fear he inspired could become a protective shield if carefully managed. He observed the reactions of his fellow slaves, noting who panicked, who remained composed, and who might serve as allies or unintended threats. He learned to communicate silently, to signal and respond without words, creating a network of subtle coordination. His fortress was both a home and a command center, a place from which he could orchestrate movements across the plantation using terrain, observation, and cunning to his advantage. The young man's methods evolved beyond sabotage. He began to leave cryptic warnings, carefully placed messages that suggested omnipresence and intelligence behind the disruptions. Tools would vanish, only to reappear in conspicuous locations, suggesting that someone or something was always watching. Footprints led in misleading directions, and sounds in the forest at odd hours made overseers uneasy, forcing them to question their own perceptions. These tactics were not only clever but deeply unsettling, turning ordinary fear into a pervasive dread. He understood the power of uncertainty. People fear most what they cannot see, predict, or control, and he wielded that fear like a weapon. Physical confrontations, though rare at this stage, were carefully staged to reinforce the psychological effects. A startled guard might stumble into a pit he had hidden, or a horse might bolt at the sound of a carefully timed noise. The young man orchestrated these events with precision, ensuring that no evidence pointed directly to him, but that the cumulative effect on morale, confidence, and authority was undeniable. He began to realize that he was no longer merely reacting to oppression. He was shaping it, bending it to his will without ever revealing the extent of his capabilities. The forest, the fortress, and his understanding of human psychology converged into a force far greater than the sum of its parts. As his acts of revenge increased in sophistication, he also refined his personal skills. He practiced moving silently, climbing, and navigating the terrain with ever greater confidence. He learned to predict behavior, anticipating the movements of overseers and masters alike. He tested the limits of his traps and the resilience of his shack, ensuring that his base remained secure even as he extended his influence outward. His physical strength, honed over years of labor, was complemented by an equally disciplined mind. He had become a strategist, a tactician, and a master of the subtle arts of fear and manipulation. The impact on the plantation was profound. The overseers grew cautious, suspicious of one another, and increasingly paranoid. Tools were checked and rechecked, gates secured, and paths examined, yet the disruptions persisted, subtle and elusive. Each small success emboldened the young man, reinforcing the power of patience, observation, and intelligence. He had learned that vengeance need not be immediate or violent to be effective. It could be psychological, strategic, and relentless, creating a climate of uncertainty that undermined the authority of the oppressors. Despite the growing confidence, he maintained discipline and restraint. He knew that a single miscalculation could undo years of preparation, that exposure could lead to brutal reprisal not only for him but for others on the plantation. Each action was weighed against potential consequences, each decision calculated for maximum effect with minimal risk. The young man's mind had become a constant balance of opportunity and caution, strategy and subtlety, ensuring that every step forward reinforced his ultimate goal: freedom and justice against those who had stolen his life. As the weeks passed, his network of influence expanded. Trusted allies among the enslaved became aware in part of his methods, sharing discreet warnings or assisting in minor ways without ever fully understanding the scope of his plan. These allies were carefully chosen, their loyalty tested through observation and small tasks, ensuring that they would not betray him under pressure. This silent collaboration extended his reach, allowing him to manipulate events across the plantation while maintaining his own invisibility. His fortress, once a secluded base, now served as a nerve center for a campaign of cunning, disruption, and revenge that spread like a quiet storm across the mountainside. The young man also learned the subtle art of timing. Some acts were executed at dawn, exploiting the drowsiness of overseers. Others were performed under the cover of night, when the fog, darkness, and forest sounds masked movement. He experimented with sequences, combining multiple small actions to create larger effects, testing the boundaries of attention, perception, and human psychology. The plantation became a chessboard, the overseers and masters' pieces to be maneuvered, delayed, and occasionally toppled, all without revealing the hand behind the moves. Psychologically, the young man felt a transformation within himself. The fear that had once defined him was replaced with purpose, determination, and a growing sense of empowerment. Every act of sabotage, every careful manipulation, reinforced his belief that intelligence, patience, and cunning could overcome brute force. He began to see himself not merely as a victim of circumstance, but as an active agent, shaping events, influencing outcomes, and reclaiming control over a life that had long been dominated by others. The shack, his fortress, and the surrounding forest were now allies in this mission, each element contributing to a growing power that demanded recognition, even if silently. The impact extended beyond the physical. Among the enslaved, whispers began to circulate, stories of an unseen force disrupting the plantation, creating hope where resignation had once prevailed. The young man had become a symbol, a shadow of possibility, demonstrating that resistance was not only possible but effective. The psychological weight of fear, uncertainty, and hope interwove, shaping the minds and behaviors of all who lived and worked in the mountains. Through these actions, he realized that revenge was not a sin, act, but a process, a continuous application of intelligence, patience, and skill to bend circumstances toward justice. The young man understood that his campaign was far from over. Each act of disruption, each carefully orchestrated incident was a step toward a larger goal, a testing of his strategies, and a rehearsal for more significant actions yet to come. The fortress he had built, the knowledge he had gained, and the psychological edge he had established were all preparatory, laying the groundwork for eventual confrontation. The forest, the terrain, and the meticulously designed shack provided him with both security and leverage, ensuring that when the decisive moment arrived, he would be ready not only to survive, but to strike with precision, intelligence, and calculated force. Through these early acts, he discovered the intoxicating blend of strategy and execution. Each success reinforced his patience, each failure refined his methods, and each observation deepened his understanding of both people and the landscape. The young man was no longer merely a boy reacting to cruelty. He had become a tactician, a master of subtlety and timing, and a force whose presence, though hidden, was profoundly felt. He had begun to convert suffering into opportunity, oppression into strategic advantage, and fear into a tool that would ultimately serve his vision of justice and freedom. By the end of this period, the young man had firmly established himself as a shadow in the mountains, a hidden force whose reach extended beyond the walls of his shack into the minds of those who had long assumed they were untouchable. His first strikes of revenge had been quiet, subtle, and devastatingly effective, proving that intelligence, preparation, and patience could create power where brute strength alone had previously reigned. He had tested his fortress, tested his understanding of human behavior, and tested himself, emerging from each trial stronger, wiser, and more confident in his ability to shape events according to his will. In this way, the mountains bore witness to the transformation of a young man from oppressed boy to cunning strategist, from survivor to orchestrator, from silent observer to actor of precise and deliberate vengeance. Every movement, every trap, every disruption was a lesson in power, patience, and control. The shack, once humble and unassuming, now stood as the command center of his campaign, a fortress that embodied not only physical strength, but mental acuity, resilience, and the unyielding determination to reclaim agency in a world that had long denied him freedom. The time had finally come when patience, preparation, and cunning would meet their ultimate test. The young man, once a boy born into chains, had transformed into a strategist whose mind was as sharp as any weapon, whose patience had been honed by years of observation and suffering, and whose fortress now stood as a testament to his ingenuity and perseverance. The Blue Ridge Mountains, silent witnesses to his transformation, held their mist and shadows as allies, concealing him while amplifying the terror of those who had long believed themselves untouchable. The plantation, once a theater of oppression and dominance, had become a stage for the reckoning he had long envisioned. Every trap, every secret passage, every subtle disruption of the past months had been a rehearsal, a careful training for the day when action would be decisive, deliberate, and unavoidable. It began with the overseers, whose paranoia had reached a fever pitch. Each minor act of sabotage, each cryptic warning, each hidden trap had chipped away at their confidence, leaving them uncertain, fearful, and increasingly reckless. They had doubled patrols, questioned one another, and inspected every path, gate, and field, yet the disruptions continued. The young man observed them from the high ground, noting their mistakes, exploiting their blind spots, and anticipating their overreactions. He had learned that fear, when carefully applied, could control more than force ever could, but the time had come to combine psychological terror with a decisive confrontation, one that would leave a lasting mark and finally assert his dominance in a tangible, undeniable way. He struck under the cover of pre-dawn fog when visibility was minimal and the human senses most unreliable. Using the hidden exits and concealed vantage points he had perfected over years, he moved silently across the terrain, positioning himself where the overseers and masters would least expect. Small disturbances were set in motion in advance. A strategically placed log shifted to create noise. A hidden stone triggered to startle a horse, and a trail carefully manipulated to mislead and confuse. Each act was part of a carefully choreographed sequence designed to maximize confusion, isolate targets, and create opportunities for confrontation without exposing himself to unnecessary risk. When the moment arrived, the young man acted with precision. One of the overseers, chasing what he believed to be the source of the disturbances, found himself caught in a concealed pit, the sudden fall leaving him incapacitated and disoriented. Another, attempting to pursue along a false trail, stumbled over a hidden snare, toppling into a shallow trench and sending a cascade of rocks and debris down the slope. Panic spread quickly among the men, their confidence shattered, their movements uncoordinated. From his concealed position, the young man observed, controlling the battlefield not through sheer strength, but through preparation, timing, and the meticulous application of strategy. Each action reinforced the realization that he was no longer merely a boy or a subordinate, but a force to be reckoned with, invisible yet omnipresent, intelligent, and relentless. The masters, alerted by the growing chaos, arrived on horseback, their faces twisted in disbelief and anger. They had assumed that fear of punishment would maintain control, that brute force and intimidation would suffice to quash any rebellion, but they had underestimated the intelligence, patience, and cunning of the young man who had quietly transformed his shack into a fortress and the surrounding landscape into a trap-laden theater of retribution. They were unprepared for the combination of surprise, strategy, and psychological manipulation that now confronted them. Each step they took seemed to be anticipated, each movement countered, each attempt at assertion thwarted by the invisible hand of the man they had dismissed. From hidden vantage points he struck again, employing not direct violence alone, but the mastery of environment and timing. A carefully loosened rock dislodged from above, narrowly missing a horse but sending the rider sprawling, creating confusion and disarray. Another path, previously thought secure, had been manipulated to funnel pursuers into narrow passages lined with natural obstacles, where their movements could be delayed and controlled. Each strike was a demonstration of intellect and patience, a calculated use of fear and manipulation, leaving the masters and overseers increasingly desperate and unsure of their own perceptions. The forest, the mountains, and the carefully constructed fortress now functioned in concert, amplifying his effectiveness beyond what brute force could achieve. Amidst the chaos, the young man executed his most daring act. He appeared where he was least expected, at a location the masters had assumed entirely secure. He moved swiftly, silently, with an awareness of every possible escape or counterattack. His presence was a shock, not just because of physical appearance, but because of the audacity, intelligence, and skill it represented. The men who had once treated him with contempt now confronted a reality that they had not anticipated. A person who had turned subjugation into strategy, fear into a weapon, and the very land they thought they controlled into a barrier against their authority. The confrontation, though brief, was decisive, marked not by chaos alone, but by precision, control, and the undeniable assertion of power. The psychological impact was immediate and profound. The overseers' confidence collapsed entirely. They could no longer act decisively, could not predict movement, and were trapped within a web of fear and uncertainty that the young man had spun meticulously over years. Even the masters, whose wealth and authority had once made them seemingly untouchable, found themselves confronted with the limitations of power when faced with intelligence, patience, and strategy. They realized, perhaps too late, that dominance had never been guaranteed, that fear could be wielded by those they considered powerless, and that the quiet, patient mind of one determined individual could undo centuries of enforced authority. As the confrontation unfolded, the young man ensured that collateral harm was minimized. He was not driven by blind vengeance, but by justice and the desire to reclaim agency. His strikes were targeted, his traps precise, and his maneuvers calculated to instill fear without unnecessary destruction. Every action demonstrated mastery, discipline, and foresight, reinforcing the image of a man who was not simply reacting, but orchestrating, controlling, and executing a plan with deliberate and unwavering intent. The psychological effects on the oppressors were amplified by the knowledge that each move, each misstep, and each disruption had been anticipated and controlled, leaving them in a state of helplessness, frustration, and fear. In the aftermath of the confrontation, the young man returned to his fortress, surveying the landscape, checking traps, and ensuring that no path of escape had been overlooked. The overseers and masters retreated, defeated not by strength alone, but by intellect, strategy, and preparation. The shack, once humble and inconspicuous, now stood as the epicenter of his triumph, a fortress whose existence was a testament to patience, planning, and resilience. The surrounding forest, mountains, and terrain had amplified his power, demonstrating that freedom and justice could be reclaimed even from positions of apparent weakness. The victory had consequences beyond the immediate confrontation. Among the enslaved, hope surged. Tales of the young man's cunning, patience, and audacity spread like wildfire, creating a sense of possibility and empowerment that had been suppressed for generations. He had demonstrated that intelligence and preparation could overcome brutality and oppression, that fear could be wielded strategically, and that the landscape itself could be transformed into an ally for those who dared to think beyond survival. He had not reclaimed personal agency, but had created a symbol of resistance, a model for strategic defiance, and a legacy that would inspire others for years to come. Yet he remained disciplined, knowing that the battle for freedom was ongoing. He reinforced the fortress, improved the traps, and maintained vigilance, understanding that complacency could undo even the most meticulous plans. The lessons of patience, observation, and strategic thinking remained as vital as ever, for while this confrontation had succeeded, the broader struggle for justice and survival continued. Each day became a balance of maintaining control, refining strategies, and preparing for future challenges, ensuring that the fortress was not just a place of victory, but a platform for ongoing resilience. In the quiet moments, as the sun set behind the peaks of the Blue Ridge, the young man reflected on the transformation he had undergone. He had moved from a boy oppressed by circumstance to a strategist and master of his own fate, turning suffering into opportunity, observation into action, and vulnerability into strength. The shack, now fortified and layered with ingenuity, symbolized not just physical security, but the culmination of years of learning, patience, and deliberate effort. It represented a triumph of intellect and will over brute force and cruelty, a concrete manifestation of a journey from subjugation to empowerment. The mountains themselves seemed to acknowledge his mastery. The forests, streams, and cliffs that had once been silent observers had become active participants in his strategy, amplifying his influence and concealing his movements. Every path, ridge, and hollow played a role in the delicate balance of power he had established. The Blue Ridge, harsh yet beautiful, oppressive yet forgiving to those who understood it, had become both mentor and ally, shaping him into a man-cap, able of extraordinary foresight and action. His legacy was secured not just in the physical triumphs, but in the psychological transformation of all who witnessed or heard of his actions. The overseers and masters were left wary, uncertain, and deeply aware that control was never guaranteed. Among the enslaved, whispers of strategy, cunning, and the possibilities of resistance became part of daily conversation, seeding hope and inspiring quiet acts of intelligence, patience, and defiance. The young man had demonstrated that freedom could be pursued not merely with brute strength, but with intellect, observation, and the disciplined application of skill over time. In this final phase, he understood that revenge and justice were intertwined with responsibility. The power he had cultivated demanded careful stewardship, and he maintained vigilance to ensure that his actions did not spiral into unnecessary chaos. Each decision was deliberate, each act of defiance measured, reinforcing the principles of strategy, restraint, and intelligence that had guided him from the earliest days of observation to the decisive confrontation now behind him. The fortress was not only a physical space, but a moral and strategic center, embodying his growth, wisdom, and the hard-earned lessons of survival, patience, and cunning. As night fell over the Blue Ridge, the young man looked from the peaks down to the plantation below, the shadows stretching long and uncertain. He knew that the struggle for justice was ongoing, that vigilance would always be necessary, but he also recognized the undeniable truth of his journey. He had transformed oppression into opportunity, fear into strategy, and vulnerability into strength. His shack, his fortress, and the knowledge he had cultivated were more than tools, they were symbols of resilience, intelligence, and the unwavering pursuit of freedom. He reclaimed agency over his life, turned suffering into power, and ensured that the story of defiance, cunning, and triumph would endure in the mountains long after he was gone. In the end, the young man's victory was not merely personal. It was a lesson etched into the fabric of the Blue Ridge Mountains, a narrative of resistance and resilience that would inspire those who came after. The fortress, the traps, the strategies, and the careful application of intelligence demonstrated that freedom was never simply granted. It was claimed through observation, patience, courage, and calculated action. And in this moment, the young man, once a boy in chains, stood not just as a survivor, but as a master of his own destiny, a strategist whose legacy would ripple through time, whispered among the trees, echoed across the slopes, and remembered wherever courage met cunning in the face of oppression.